I am not going to read, do not be alarmed. I carry this as a kind of security blanket, and then I hold it up, unless you want me to read. But in fact, what we're supposed to do is talk about the book, or about my books in general, or the writing techniques, whatever you like during the Q&A. And the most recent one. But let me start this way. Whenever there is a group like this, or there's a bookstore event, or just something involving talking about your career, I find that invariably the question that comes up, almost first of all, is where did you get the idea? Why this book? How did you come to write this? How did you put it together? And of course, usually this is an impossible question to answer because ideas are inchoate, they just come as they will. There's a lot of magical thinking that goes on in the writing game. We don't quite know where all of this comes from or how it can be directed. But in this one instance, I'm very lucky because I do know where it comes from. My books now and have always begun with place. The first time I ever thought about writing was in the summer of '95. I had not written before. I was a publisher most of my life, so I crossed to the other side of the desk. And I didn't have manuscripts secretly in drawers. I wasn't trying to get out of my day job. I wasn't really thinking about this at all. But in the summer of '95, I went to the Southwest on vacation to do some hiking. I love the Southwest. I think it's a really beautiful part of the country. Not serious hiking, in Reeboks. I mean, I don't do that kind of thing. And we were in Santa Fe, which is 40 miles from Los Alamos, center of the Manhattan Project. And I had always been interested in World War II, and so I knew a fair amount about it. And since we were in the vicinity, I said, gee, I'd love to see it. That would be cool. Let's go up to Los Alamos, which is on a very high mesa. You have to climb and climb and climb. And therefore, a very isolated one. It is now a remarkable place. I don't know if any of you have been. It's now a city of 10,000 people. It had been gated until 1962, but it's now open. You can just go. And because most of the wartime housing and administration and laboratory buildings were meant to be temporary and not really survive the war or the project, indeed they did not. And most of the buildings that now exist there were put up in the 50s or the 60s. The result being that it's a kind of Ozzie and Harriet dream town. There are a few of the old things, but very few. And mostly it's like walking into a television sitcom. And you could be in Oregon or in Ohio or just anywhere USA. And yet, the work that is being done there is still cutting-edge scientific research. And I had just been in the little historical museum they have. They only had 50 years of history, so we're not talking about a major event. The Manhattan Project moved or began at Los Alamos in early 1943. So we're not talking about a long period of time. And consequently, they had many of the things that interested me most, which was the daily life that was being led there. You can see driver's licenses that are made out to numbers because nobody could be identified and people would use pseudonyms. And I thought, here it is looking like this sitcom, but at one time, this was the most secret place on Earth. It did not technically exist. It was not on maps. The local state trooper, if they caught you speeding and they saw your license, would just say, go, we have no idea who you are. It was not like now with WikiLeaks. It was the war, and if you were told not to ask questions, mostly you didn't. And sometimes you would hear gunfire or explosions going off on the mesa, and you'd say, I wonder what they're doing up there, but you didn't push it, and you didn't inquire. People were not allowed out once you had signed up. And I thought, what was that like? What was it like to go to a place that you almost literally went off the planet? You didn't go home for Thanksgiving. You got mailed to an post office box number. Nobody knew where you were. I thought, and you were there for the duration. And I thought, what was that like? And I was walking around, and it was at that moment, if we were doing a Roz Chast cartoon, where the light bulb goes off over your head. And I thought, gee, what would have happened if there had been a crime? How would they go about solving it? This was a place that did not technically exist. No police were allowed up on the mesa. They weren't even meant to know it was there. The only kind of security at all was essentially to man the gates and make sure that nobody got out or in. And there were a few MPs to settle bar fights among the GIs that might be there, but technically speaking, there was no investigative unit. There was no way to determine this. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting situation. And I was still in publishing, and I thought, that's a really good idea. Who can I give it to? Who's looking for an idea? Who's between books? And nobody was. And also, it's never a good idea to give ideas. You should really have your own, because you won't have any passion when you're writing it. And much to my surprise, I was the one who developed a passion for it. I kept thinking about it. I thought, this is really intriguing. What would be the reaction of the scientists on the project? And I thought, probably annoyance. They were doing something of extreme importance and urgency, and they don't want to be bothered being interviewed by some pseudo-cop, what's going on, and why, and violence is always disturbing, and what would be the effect of this crime on the community? And I thought, more and more interesting. But something else was going on, and I think it's important that there always be, when people write, there's the primary layer, the idea, the thing, the motive that is going to generate the plot. But there's also, what I find much more interesting, the sub-layer. What's the context? What's the place? What's the society you're writing about? There's subsequently also a moral layer, which we'll come to in a minute, but it's the second one that interested me then. And partly what was going on was the summer of '95, and it was the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima. And there was a lot of op-ed stuff and a lot of things in the press, as of course there would be. And but to me it seemed skewed and very odd, because at this point I really did know a fair amount about the Manhattan Project. I'm not against revisionist history. I think that every generation has the right to look at the world from the angle at which they see it, assuming that the facts are correct. And yet, I thought they're getting this all wrong. Everything is being presented as, they were carrying 50 years of nuclear baggage, the same 50 years that we're all carrying, if you were my age. I was one of those kids who ducked under desks during air raid drills, etc. And the way the project was being written about is that they were a group of Dr. Strangeloves who'd all gone off to the desert to plot the end of the world and to give us this horrible legacy. And I thought, the truth is, or the complete truth about this, is so much more interesting and complicated than that. The average age of the scientists on the project was 27. Oppenheimer himself was just turning 40 during it. These were kids. This was like the Silicon Valley of the 40s. And I thought at that point, which sort of drove me even further into doing this, a question that I think occurs to a lot of writers, in a good way. I think it's an empathetic question that should motivate people, is what if it had been you? What would you have done? And I thought, supposing you were this kid at Caltech, good at physics, and maybe not so good you didn't have great eyesight, so you weren't drafted. And the government came to you and said, we'd like you to come and work for us. You're going to go away, nobody will know, we don't know when it's going to be over, you just drop off the planet. You just go somewhere. On the other hand, you will be with the 40 or 50 people in the world who are at the top of your profession, and in those days there were only about 50 people. Most of them have no bills, maybe you'll get one too. You're going to cross a frontier of science. You are going to unlock one of the secrets of the universe. How do you split the atom? How do you do this? This is a real game changer. And you're going to win the war for us. I would have said yes. And I would have been one of those people that were now being written about in op-ed pieces. And I thought, this is a subject. This is something that's really worthy of digging into even further. And because I think that all books have, well, not all books, but I think any book with any amount of seriousness at all has a moral component, and should. And I thought, what's going on here, the more I thought about it, is what happens when good people do supposedly the right things for the right reasons, and yet create this appalling legacy. How do you, this is a real conundrum. How do you do this? By that time I was totally hooked, and I know you had said earlier that I should say how I came to write. Well, I came to write because I got so fascinated in this thing that I just went into it. But since I was a publisher, I made it my secret project. It was my Manhattan project. I didn't tell anybody I was doing it because I didn't know if I could. And what could be more humiliating than a publisher who can't write? And it's not always the most generous of industries, and so I imagine going to parties and people saying, oh, how's the book? So I did. In the end, it became a Cinderella ending because I did, in fact, do the book in secret, and I did write it, and I showed it to an agent that I worked with, and anyway, we got into business, and here we are, 6 books later. But all of them have essentially followed that kind of pattern. There's a place or a society that you want to know more about. My wife once said to me, you know, when you write books, it's like you're signing up for another graduate course. It's just something that you want to know more about, and something that you want to investigate and discover about the world. I think that's true. I know that there's a cliche, and no doubt you've heard it a million times, only write what you know. I think this is such nonsense. I think mostly it's being said as an excuse to just write about yourself. I know as much about myself as I want to know. You know, I don't want any more therapy. I don't want to do a diary. I want to know about other things, other people, what's going on in the rest of the world. I once was a guest teacher at a creative writing class. And they said, well, we don't really do assignments. And I said, well, today you're going to do one. It was a very short assignment. And they said, what? And I said, there are 2 people in the room, and neither of them are you. Do anything you want with it. I don't care how you write it, but it's not you. Anyway, this one, my prop, the latest one, followed an extremely similar pattern. I wrote this book, and we're talking about it now, because I went to Istanbul on holiday a few years ago, and I fell in love with it. And I mean that word in its full sense. There's no explaining why some places attract you and others don't, or why you have an almost visceral reaction to them and are just immediately taken with them. I think most people certainly like Istanbul who go there, and I hope some of you have been lucky enough to go or will go. It is one of the great, great places in the world, I think. And everything there conspires to please the tourist. You know, the hills and the topography and the Bosphorus and the boat traffic and the food and architecture. It's a great place. But what particularly fascinated me, given what I was doing, was the layering of history that goes on there. I know this happens in a few other places in the world, but there it happens very, very dramatically. You know, we're thrilled if we see a Victorian house. We think it's exciting. But let us imagine for 1 second your trip to Istanbul, and you leave the airport. You take a taxi, it's cheap, you can afford it, it's fine, besides it's easier. And you will find yourself on Ataturk Boulevard, crossing the old town, the old city, on the way to your hotel. And you look up at a certain point, the traffic is roaring around you, and you're passing under some arches. And what this is the aqueduct of the Emperor Valens, which was put up in the 4th century. And not only is it still standing, but it was delivering water to the city as recently as the turn of the 20th century. That to me is really old and very interesting. After you drop the bags, go to Galata Hill, and there's a tower put up by the Genoese in the 14th century when they had a trade concession. And as you stand there, if you look straight ahead, this pincushion of minarets, this great postcard view that is famous to all of you, is Sultanate, is the old city, the Ottoman center. To your right is the Golden Horn, the great harbor of the ancient world. To your left, as you stand this way, the mighty Bosphorus, which now you'll see filled with oil tankers going to Russia. But in those days, featured Jason sailing the Argo, looking for the Golden Fleece. It just surrounds you everywhere. Where you were, there have been people in this place. There's a history lesson only gone for another minute, I promise. There were people there from, it is thought, the 7th century BC, a sort of Greek fishing village called Byzantium, which grew and prospered and became part of the Roman Empire, and that took 1,000 years. There was then another 1,000 years of the Byzantine Empire. There was then 400 years of the Ottomans, which is certain who created the city that is familiar to us today. And this ends in 1922, when finally the Sultanate is abolished, and it paves the way for Ataturk, an army officer, to create modern Turkey. Okay. And therein ends the lesson, by the way, but also therein ends most of the guidebooks that you look at. Now, it isn't that you're short of material, you have almost 3,000 years of things to look at, but I wanted more. I was interested in what happened during the period that I've written about. All of my books, I didn't intend this when I started, but maybe it's a kind of recycling process. Once you get into a period, it's very hard to leave it because there's always more to explore. And all of my books have been about the immediate aftermath of World War II. And I thought, what was that like here? I knew that it was a neutral city. It had been neutral throughout almost all the war. It didn't enter on the side of the Allies until February '45, and that was mostly paved the way for membership in the United Nations. They didn't really fight. And they performed this balancing act. It was a poor country. They didn't want to get stuck as they had in the First World War with a disastrous outcome, and so they remained neutral. And I thought, how do you do that? How do you sit out the war that is happening 20 or 30 kilometers away? I mean, Nazi-occupied Europe, which included Bulgaria at that point, was right on the border. How do you do that? And of course the answer was, as I looked into it, you don't. You don't sit out a war, you don't sit out that war. If you do, the war comes to you. And one of the ways in which the war came to Istanbul was in the form of spies. Lots and lots of spies. As a neutral city so close to occupied Europe, it became a listening post for everybody. And one of those areas where all the services could intertwine. The Brits were old hands in the Mideast, so they were there certainly. The Nazis, naturally, there were a few Japanese even. The Russians, for this they have a genius, you know, they were always there. And even the new Americans. The OSS wasn't formed until 1943, so this book takes place in spring '45. So we're talking about a very, very young group, very green. It turns out that all the other forces knew immediately who we were. But indeed, we fielded a complete force of over 40 people in various levels of secrecy. And there they were. And looking at all of them, at all of these competing security agencies, is the Emniyet, the Turkish one, which has the home ground advantage because they know what's going on, and they're the Ottoman inheritors. So they're all watching each other, and I thought, well, you know, if you write the sort of books that I write, this is catnip. This is really good stuff. There's something here. This is really intriguing. So you do more and more, and you read more and more because you're so intrigued. And then I came across a description of an evening at the Park Hotel bar. In those days, there were two great hotels. One was the Parrot Palace, which still exists, which had been built for the Orient Express, and is located right across a small street from the American consulate, or what was then the American consulate. At the other end of the European border, beyond Taksim, where all the protests have just been, and right across from the German consulate was the legendary Park Hotel, with a great balcony that faced the Bosporus and one of the great views of all time. Hélas, it has since become a high-rise parking garage. But when I was most recently in Istanbul, the parking garage was now being converted to high-rise condos. So at least somebody will get that view ultimately back. But the hotel is gone. The description, however, had the barman who was working for 2 and possibly 3 secret services of various loyalties. There was a Japanese person sitting in the corner pretending he wasn't. There were Nazis, and there were Russians, and there were these Americans who thought that nobody thinks I just happened to be in Istanbul in 1945, etc. And I thought, oh my God, it's the real Rick's Cafe. This is the real Casablanca. This is where it was happening. At that point, the hook was in. I thought, you have to do it. It's, this is like dropped out of the sky for you. It's really wonderful. But in order to do this, and this is part of the process of how you write these books, if you write in period, there are some people who call these historical. I'm old enough to think of this as the recent past. I don't write about the Crusades. This is just times that are just recent. Anyway, I thought, but you have to go back to Istanbul 45. And there are 2 processes in doing this, the first being place. And it's not as easy as one might think. The Istanbul that I hope you will see, aside from anything else, has 12 million more people than they had in 1945. And most of those are Turks. In 1945, Istanbul was still a polyglot, diverse, kind of fading imperial capital. The old Ottomans it wasn't so long ago. And it's a fascinating, I mean, Ladino is still spoken, which is the Sephardic Jewish language, etc., etc. There were signs in Ladino that practically nowhere else in the world was this still happening. That's not true now, but it was true in 45. So if you're going to recreate what your characters would see if they were walking down the street, you need to do what I call literary archaeology. I love maps. Old maps I think are really useful. Tram lines get discontinued. A bridge gets thrown up at a certain point. Street names get changed for political reasons. Everything is in flux, as it is everywhere in the world. And I had once written about Berlin, which is an extreme example of that. So you look at maps, and you read every memoir you can of the period, and particularly contemporary journalism, because the assumptions that are being made are just as interesting often as the information. You look at photographs. You do everything you can to really recreate this. If you could afford it, where would you have lived in 1945? What were the smart neighborhoods? Where did the chic people want to live? What were the restaurants? Where was it hard to get a reservation? Where might you see somebody else? This is the stuff of life. Not all of this need appear on the page, and not all of it need be relevant to the plot, but if it's not in your head, you're never going to be able to see what your protagonist sees. The most pleasurable part of the research is actually being in the place, and I love to walk the city. I think you never know a place until you're on the ground with it. And I want to know distances. I want to know where was his office? Could he walk to work? If he couldn't, would he have to take a tram? How does all that work? So you dig and dig, and you put that together, which is a kind of enthralling thing to do. It's fun. It's like creating this world in your head. And then you get to the second part of this, which I think is even more difficult, which is to put yourself back in time. I think very few of us realize how truly locked into a worldview of right now we are. It's hard to put yourself in another time period. For instance, here we are in 1945 for the moment. Things that to us seem impossibly distant and remote have recently happened in 1945. We talk about the Ottomans now as if it's something out of Disney or a fairy tale world, with eunuchs and harems and all this stuff. But it ended in 1922. So in 1945, it would only be 23 years ago, which in our time would now be 1991. I mean, we'd be in the first Bush administration. The Sultan who had just left would be Reagan. I don't think of this on a chronological timeline as, this is just something that happened. But it also informs the book, because once you put that together, that time thing, you realize that there are people who are going to walk around your pages, but certainly were walking around the city, who had worked for the empire, who may be in a state of despair or disappointment because they loved it, or maybe gratitude because their lives have changed and turned some way, but it would be part of their worldview, it would be part of what they were thinking of. Sometimes the sheer chronology of the thing can actually suggest characters. I was intrigued, for instance, I read a few accounts of what happened when the harem was abolished after a political coup in 1909. I thought, okay, 1909, that means that's 36 years ago. Because there were young children in the harem, there could easily be women walking around the Istanbul that you are now living in this book, who had been in the harem, who had been slaves. What was that story? So indeed, one of them does exist in this book. She's called Lily, and she was a child. I mean, they weren't there for sexual purposes if they were children. It was almost like geishas. They were being trained in manners and how to do this. I mean, later, of course, things would change. But they weren't being abused as children. But what happened to them all? What happens when the harem is ended? And it turns out these girls, messages are sent back to their families, Circassian families, and saying, come get your daughters. And people who had been dressed in jewels and silks are now going to be taken back to some peasant farm, or maybe nobody comes. Nobody picks them up. What is their fate, etc. So I thought, this is all wonderful, and I'm going to use this to create this character. But you have to be thrifty about your character, so she's a double-barreled thing. I needed a socialite who could give a grand party in a yali. These are the mansions that line the Bosphorus. I think you can't do this book without a great party scene. It's wonderful. So the old Lily from the harem was so lucky as to marry someone who was immensely wealthy, and she has become the great socialite who gives this party. I thought that that was a happy ending for her, didn't she? She had gone through some of this. Anyway, as the street in your head begins to fill with all of these people, and you realize how astonishingly diverse this city was and how many different kinds of people you're going to have to deal with, the next thing that occurs to you is that your protagonist or your main characters, who are going to be Americans, of course, because I am, and this is how we're looking at the world, would probably not know much of this. There would be almost a neo-colonial kind of attitude of, you know, we go to the club, and we see ourselves, and we have our own social life, and you know, we don't bother with those people. And also the war is on. They've really got their own sort of acts to run. But I needed someone who would look at all of this. So the protagonist is an American businessman called Leon Bauer, which in German, as you probably know, means farmer, but it also means pawn in the game of chess. And Leon is working for an American company. He loves Istanbul. He's been there for years. He's fluent in Turkish, so he's useful in many ways. And he can appreciate the kinds of people we're just talking about that are filling the streets. He really gets it. He knows what's going on. But because he's also a patriotic American and the war is on, and he wants to do something for the war, he has become involved in a marginal way in this secret world. He's not a big spy. He does some courier work. He sort of works on the fringes. He does it because it's the right thing to do, because of the war and something that he can help with. But also there's a little point where, you know, if you're at the park bar at night, there's a frisson in knowing that you're in on it and you understand what's going on. He's drawn to it. What's going to happen is that he is going to take a passage to the dark side of this world that he thought was enticing and intriguing. And what he's going to have to learn is that when you set about creating webs, be very, very careful you don't fall in one yourself. His is not the, there are several passages in this book, the title is meant to be that way. There's one in a boat that looks very, very like the one that's actually on the cover. This boat would be listing, barely seaworthy, creaky, leaky. It would have cost a fortune in bribes and hard currency, usually Palestinian sterling pounds. And it would have been leased from some unscrupulous person on the Black Sea, and it would be filled with refugee Jews. And they were the people who were, one of the things I discovered and which became a great component in the story, and I think research leads you in directions that sometimes you hadn't anticipated, is that Istanbul, all during the war, operated as an escape valve for European Jews who were lucky enough to funnel out through there. I think most of us have the notion that after 1940 it was just a walled fortress, Europe, and nobody got out, and that's pretty much the case. Very, very few people did, but some were very lucky. There was still the Budapest-Baghdad train that was running once a week through Istanbul, and if you had managed enough bribes, and if you had managed to get a fake ticket, you might get out, and then get onto the spur that would take you to Palestine. But mostly you were coming in boats like this. You would get on in Constantia, in one of the Romanian Black Sea ports, and if you got through the U-boats that the Nazis had in the Black Sea, you got to Istanbul, and if you got your transit visa through there, and if you got through the British blockade, and ultimately you might get to Palestine. Thousands did. It was great, and the Mossad was operating in Istanbul all during the war, out of the Hotel Intercontinental. Leon would know about this because his wife, who was German Jewish, had worked for Mossad, and it helped. But she suffered a trauma during one of the great tragedies that happened, which is based on a real sinking of the Struma. There was a boat that just completely went down. And it has done things to her mind. So this is a plot, secondary plot that Leon has to deal with. What he does not know, and what I did not know until I researched this, is that there were also Jews being sold through Istanbul. It turned out that in the Balkans, where anti-Semitism was rife, and particularly in Romania, Yes, can you take? Yeah.
Thank you.
And particularly in Romania, which is the only country other than Germany itself that actually built a death camp. Romania had been a German ally, but as the war began to turn and they saw that that the Soviets were about to invade them, and they'd better change sides again, which they ultimately did, they came up with a scheme that they would offer Jews for sale.
Could you go closer
Yeah.
to the mic?
Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
Okay. $300 a head, children, adults, it doesn't matter who, but it was $300. Or they were sent to the camp. That was the deal. No one technically could do this because if you paid the money, you were, quote, trading with the enemy, Romania being a Nazi ally. So the American Jewish Committee, the War Refugee Board, using FDR knew about this. There was a secret mission formed with a man called Ira Hirschman, who was an executive at Bloomingdale's. And they got Morgenthau and the Treasury to sign off on this and saying, anything you're doing is not trading with the enemy. We understand this is a special thing. And he bargained and got people out. In his memoir, he claims to have got as many as 15,000 out. I would have thought 2 would be a lot. And I thought, this is one of these great unknown stories, or it was unknown to me. And it belongs as part of the great story of Istanbul. I think the book becomes a mosaic about this town in 1945. So this was a part of it. There are several other passages which we don't have to go through. There is a defector who knows a lot about the Soviet Union, and he's about to make his last turn to the Americans as a way of saving himself. There is a wife's infidelity who is crossing a line in that way. But most of all, what the book is about, we come to that final component, I think, of any book. It's about Leon's moral passage and what he's going to have to do and decide. At a certain point toward the end, he says, what do you do when there's no right thing to do? Just the wrong thing. I think that life frequently presents us with this kind of choice, non-choice. What's the least harmful thing you could do? What's the, the least dishonest approach to this? I think what life never does is give us the chance, or is not to make, you have to make these choices. It doesn't give us the option out. You're going to have to do one or the other. The book ultimately is about the choice that Leon has to make on Galata Bridge, which is right on the cover. I hope that you all find that his trip there and what he ultimately decides becomes as interesting and complicated as the city that inspired it. But this is where you end up when you start with place. And I have to be very careful where I go on vacation because I may want to, do research. So I only want to go to places that I want to go back to over and over. Anyway, I've blathered on for far too long. And why don't we do questions if you have some, and I'll address what you really are interested in. Yeah.
You mentioned when you were doing research for your book that you used old maps and you went to the city and you walked around. What other sources did you use?
It was all print. I mean, I think the implication of the question is, did I interview people? Do you want to know?
Yeah.
Or maybe not. I mean, people have asked that, particularly on the German book, and the answer is no, I didn't. There's some film from that period that exists, but mostly it's print resources. And, the New York Public Library is just incredible. They just have everything. But old photographs are particularly useful. What's the feel of it? How did it really look? I never have, first of all, I'm not fluent in Turkish, so I couldn't do that. But it was an interesting question that came up when I wrote Los Alamos, because after the book was out, it came to my attention, I just hadn't known it at the time, that we actually knew somebody who had been a scientist on the project, and had I wanted to use that contact, I could have sat down with him for a few hours and said, oh, tell me about your time in New Mexico. The problem with this, I think, is that people remember what they remember. They don't always remember it accurately, and they remember only, if you go to a dinner, and there are 6 of you, 3 weeks later, each one of you will have a different version of what actually happened during that dinner. So it's kind of unreliable, and if you have to take in many pieces of testimony to do that, and frankly, I couldn't. You know, the German situation was slightly different. I have rudimentary German, but really not German that's fluent enough to have a research conversation. Luckily, because so much of what was interesting to me about that period either had to do with the American occupation, the Allied occupation, or the Holocaust. And it would figure in Holocaust studies, and so consequently, original German material was often translated into English, and so you had a wide variety of things to choose from. There was a funny thing, the book that I've been working on most recently, that's almost done, I'm going back to Berlin, but this time to East Berlin. And one of the things that I was doing, I went to Stasi headquarters, which are now open, and you can see some of the files that were kept on people. And it was absolutely astonishing. I mean, and some of them are translated, but mostly you have to have some German to figure out what's going on. What was amazing to me is that often what was in these files is what you give away every day to Facebook. You know? And I thought, if they had just waited for Mark Zuckerberg, they wouldn't have had to set up this whole elaborate system. You know, people were freely giving it up. The subject went to the cinema last night and saw blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I'm curious about your process when your idea first germinates and how you talk about getting grabbed by it, getting passionate about it. This is all before you've done the research, and you started mentioning things that you knew about Istanbul that formed this obsession. Where does that come from?
Well, that I think is the magical thinking part. You know, you just don't know. But you know, you're mildly intrigued. You think, oh, what's going on in this place? And you start reading. I mean, essentially it becomes one of those great excuses of, here's a project. I mean, not all of them work. You know, I mean, I'm really, really interested in, there's a city in Brazil near Rio that was sort of an Art Deco place. And during the war, Orson Welles visited it. And there's a whole thing there that I only know a little bit about. I would like to know more. And yet, I've never gone the distance of saying, why don't you commit 2 months and really find out about this, or go and see it, or read all these books. And I thought, it can wait, it can wait. But Istanbul couldn't wait. I just thought, I want to know. You know, you want to know for your own purposes, in a sense. Is that an answer? I don't know. Right?
Well, it means that it still came from you. It came from your curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I mean about who knows when you fall in love with places. You know, I love New York. I don't want to write about it. I know about it. You know, and so many people have written about it. So it's yeah.
A lot of your discussion has been about the situation, the city, the context, the historical moment. And yet I'm thinking, having read the book, the characters very alive. And I'm sort of curious, when do you shape the character, because the character drives a lot of the action, and how do you engage with these characters who are not you, ostensibly, but obviously of the city and of a moment?
I don't know. No, you know, I mean, this is truly an honest answer, and in fact, it's the joy of writing. There are some characters that are there because they have been suggested by the context. I mean, Lily's an example of this. I mean, I thought, I want to do a harem girl. This is really interesting. I knew that there had been German refugees in the 30s who were attracted to Istanbul because Ataturk wanted them at the university. So I made Georg Ritter, the friend. He's a minor character, but I thought, okay, he's one of those people who came down to teach. The doctor is one of those people. I knew I needed an American expatriate because who else would be in such a situation there? But somebody who was familiar with the city. So they're, in an outside way, they're dictated, but then they become people.
So I'm curious if I could just do the follow-on question, which is, he has the wife who's a cripple, and it's that sort of emotional dynamic is a powerful motor engine within his, story. So when I reflect on that book, that sort of is the thing that I contemplate. I'm thinking that's a very interesting and unusual relationship to put your protagonist into, because he has a sense of duty to the wife, and yet he has this sense of sort of attraction to.
He's having an affair.
Right.
And this is built in to mirror the kind of divided loyalties that he may be having in politics, I mean, he is meant, just not to get into the minutiae of this, but he is meant to safeguard someone whom he determines is a war criminal and who isn't really worthy of his protection in a way. But who makes that decision? Who's to decide? If somebody's life is in your hands, what do you do with it? Do you sell him out? Do you protect him? What? I mean, it's a moral conundrum. So supposing you are in love with and are married to someone who may never come back from this schizophrenia that she's into, or catatonia, what do? How do you live with this? Do you stay faithful to something that maybe isn't even there, or et cetera, et cetera? I mean, I just some of those situations just come up. They just occur to you. There's no programmatic way to do this. It just happens. Yeah.
I thought your book Alibi, which I read a few years ago, admittedly I don't remember it terribly well, but I don't remember it as being, Alibi was wonderful, and partly because I adore Venice also, but I don't remember it so much as being post-war. Am I wrong? I mean, I've just forgotten that
Right,
part.
it was 1945. And in fact, it's an interesting thing because one of the things, you say, why do you pick this? I love Venice too, and I was there once in the winter when it's just a totally different city, and I was just fascinated because that's when they clean the canals. They don't want to do it in the summer when the tourists are there, and they'll dam up each end of the block, let's say, a canal, and they drain it, and then they go down and muck it out, clean up everything that's been thrown in. But what's fascinating, and you can watch it in the same way in New York, you look through those panels and watch the construction. And what was fascinating to me is that it was 3 feet down. And we think of Venice as a city floating in water, but in fact it's a series of mud islands surrounded by these little rivulets. And apparently this is the standard depth. The deepest part is under the Rialto, it's 8 or 9 feet. So we're talking very shallow water, and I thought, this is fascinating. When you look at the surface, you don't realize how close to the surface all this muck is, and I thought, what a great metaphor. But really the reason, is that I had just finished The Good German, and it was about Berlin after the war, which was a city just utterly devastated by the war in every way, physically, morally, it was just blitzed. And here was Venice, and not a single shot had been fired all during the war, and I thought, well, it's almost the alternative. It's almost the anti-Berlin. I thought, how do you go to the cafe and order, macchiato or whatever they're ordering when all of this is going on? And then I visited the ghetto, and it turns out, again, the war visits you. And I was utterly fascinated by the story of the roundup of the ghetto and when and how they came and collected the Jews. And the war visited Venice after all. And it seemed to me that, which is where the title came from, that everyone had an alibi about this. Well, I didn't know. I wasn't there. It wasn't happening on my watch. And I thought, we're talking about whole societies that have these alibis. So that's how that's right. But yeah, it was post-war. Because as you recall, he was an American soldier who's come to see his mother. So the war's over. Oh, it's on page 1. I know, it was given to you at the time. Yeah.
Do you think that having written about 1945 almost maybe by accident in the first book, then because you became familiar and more interested, then it just kept you coming back or something?
Yes, and I have to get out of it at some point because I don't want to be stuck there. But the one that I'm writing now takes place in 1948, so I'm moving a little bit further. But in fact, it's a legitimate thing. Yes, partly there's the pragmatism of once you have done research in a period, why throw it? There's more to know and you already have a great basis. There's a kind of ecological thing. But really what it is, I had been asked, why do you always write about this period? And I thought, well, you ought to think about that. Why do you write about it? And I think the answer for me is that I think it's the hinge of the century. I think it's really, really a turning point, a pivotal moment. You know, I mean, we are all so self-absorbed that we think that everything that happens to us is a seminal moment. You know, 9/11 changed the world. Well, did it? I don't know. Let's see in 50 years if it did. And maybe it did, but it's too soon to know. But 60 years on, almost 70 years on, we know that the first atomic bomb that was exploded changed the world. Everything is different before and after. I mean, once you see that you have developed the prospect of self-annihilation, we're not talking about a bigger arrow or a grenade that's more sophisticated. This could do it. This could put it all out. Nuclear winter. That's a change. And I think that for us in the West, not necessarily in Asia, but I think that the revelation of the Holocaust has a similar kind of effect, a moral effect in the universe. I mean, we're talking about Western societies, by which I mean Europe and America, who for 200 or 300 years justified ruling everybody else on the grounds that we were so evolved and advanced. And then the evidence of this crime. How do you confront that? You know, how far along have you come? How enlightened is the society really if this is what it's doing? I think it was a real shock to the system, and there's a kind of before and after effect there that's maybe an equivalent to the bomb. So I find it's one of those periods that's inherently dramatic. I mean, you're talking about people who are no more, they're like you and me, and they're making decisions that are going to have ramifications for 50 or 60 years. And I think it's the beginning of our world. I once answered this question with a movie metaphor. And I said, you know, World War II is the worst thing that ever happened. We triumphed, and so we tend to associate it with Betty Grable movies and some happy spirits, but not everybody does. It's the opposite. Over 60 million people died. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. And, you know, the enormity of it is such that what follows is an inherent drama. I think that, you know, it's a dividing point. So the movie metaphor that I started, I said, you know, and it's very interesting. The war begins with the black and white clarity of Casablanca. It's romantic. We know who's who. We know who should be singing the Marseillaise. We know whose side we're on. It's all clear. And the problem, you and me don't amount to a hill of beans and all of that. But the war ends with the third man, where everything is just murky and gray and maybe not as clear-cut as you thought it was. And people are not necessarily noble and easily black and white. They're gray. And I think the world we've inherited is a morally gray world, and we're having to parse that. That was a long-winded answer. Does anyone else dare ask a question? Anyone? Yeah, do
A different question. When did you stop your publishing? When did you change jobs?
When I wrote this book, I mean, the first book that I was talking about, I mean, you know, I did it in secret and then I gave it to an agent, and in fact it sold and I was able to do it. So 1995 or early 6 is when I changed. I was 50 years old, so it's a kind of poster boy thing for you can make a career change. Do I wish I had done it earlier? I don't know. I mean, I love doing it now. I think there's a time in your life when you're ready to do it. And it's different for everybody. I mean, there are a lot of people that want to do it when they're right, that is, when they're 22. I liked what I was doing. I liked office life. I liked the busyness of it and the phones and, you know, 40 pink while you were out sheets, you know, and how important you were and all of that. It's great. And then I like this even better, and it's wonderful. And I think in a way it enables you to appreciate how really lucky it is to be able to do any kind of creative work. I think most of us spend our lives working for and with other people because most of us have to. We don't have the luxury of not doing so, and that's life. You have responsibilities. And therefore, to be able to spend any time in your head and to do work that is just yours and something that you're directing is a great gift. And you appreciate, for instance, if it's not going well when I'm writing, I think you could be at the Monday morning executive staff meeting where you want to open a vein, because it's so boring. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you if your former life informs your life as a writer, or if you have just completely turned your back on it and live in your head. Is there like a parting of the ways?
Both. Here's the thing. My wife is an agent, and so you never, once you're in the light, you never really get out of it. No. Does it affect the writing? No, not at all. It turns out that, it's not a transferable skill set. You sit down with a piece of paper the way anybody does. So as for the writing itself, it has nothing to do with it. When you're publishing, then it's different, because having been a publisher, I know all the things that can go wrong. But I also know that if you don't let them take ownership of this, what you're just going to be is a pain in the ass, and eventually they're not going to do the job that they could do. You've just got to step back and let them do it. There's a real difference, publishers, at any given list, publisher is probably doing about 150 titles a year. You're doing one. So there's a real difference in focus on your part. But what you don't want is to be that person that, oh, you didn't call me back. And writers, the famous story about the writer and the editor who go to lunch. After the writer talked for half an hour, he said, but enough about me, let's talk about my work. And there is that aspect to it, so you have to watch out.
Okay, one more
Yes.
question, and then we're going to wrap everything up.
It's sort of a follow-up question. You loved your busy publishing life, and you were doing all this research on the side. Like, how did that work? Like with your energy, like with,
Oh, well, I had an
balance
interim period where I had left one and I was going to go into another, and we were waiting for somebody to retire. I mean, it was his gift to me because I actually had a block of time to do that. So I didn't do it at 4 in the morning.
Okay.
So you were between publishing jobs, between two publishing
Yeah,
jobs?
I mean, I wasn't out of it. There was going to be another one. It's just that I then thought, gee, look what's happened. Who knew? It was a very, very lucky thing. Look, you all know the way this works. I was lucky. To have a hit with the first book enables you to really write full time, and that's hard to do. I couldn't have done it when the kids were young, and you need to send them to school and all of that stuff. So it came at a time. But I'm not sorry that it came late. I do think that writing is a cumulative art. There aren't 8-year-old writer prodigies, as there can be music. Mozart, somebody. There isn't anything like that in writing, because I think you have to bring to it, not necessarily, you don't have to go off and be a Steve Dorr and work on a freighter and life experience. You just have to have lived and understand how people react to each other and how they are, how they talk. When someone says, write about what that thing where I was talking about before, my answer to them is, every word you put down is about you. It's everything you know. Every word you select is something that you're doing, not somebody else. Every piece of writing is individual and personal. And all you have to do is take two and compare them, and they're different. And even just to get down to what happens on the page, words and syntax, etc. Not to mention life experience. It helps to live a little and know something. Instead of writing about your parents' divorce, when you go to a writing class, they're all writing about their parents' divorce. How can they do this? Anyway, had enough, as they said in 1948. Yes, one more.
Where does your next book take place?
East Berlin
Oh, right.
in the late 40s. And after that, I don't know. So if you have a great idea, you better do it.
Go to Rio.
Okay?
Yeah, just so CFA students, we are still going to have the meeting upstairs with snacks. With Jonathan gone, we're having an alum step in, Jonas over here. So we're going to do a quick mingle, and then I'll take you guys all upstairs and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Okay.